Okay, thanks. Sorry, I'm going to speak in English. So I'm not going to talk for very long. I'd just like to say a few things. And I'm going to start by sort of reflecting on what Governor Fajardo said this morning, because I found myself in sort of immense agreement with two of the things he said, which I think are very important to understand. And so I'm just going to try to push a bit on some of those things. And two of the things he said were the need for a social transformation. So the peace agreement is not about getting 10,000 guys to put their Kalashnikovs down. It's a window of opportunity, possibly, for a much broader social, political, economic transformation. And I'm completely in agreement that the country needs that. I think one of the problems, and I'm going to illustrate it right at the end, is that the people running the country at the national level have no clue that the country needs it. They don't get it. But the fact that they don't get it is very significant, because it reflects just the architecture of the whole state and the way the society works, and which is why there's a necessity for a territorial peace. The other thing that the governor said, which I really agree with, is this issue of sort of fragmentation, the immense fragmentation of society. So that's a problem for all sorts of reasons, but I think it's particularly a problem for constructing a kind of public sphere or an interpretation of what the problem is in Colombia, and I think that's a prerequisite for actually solving the problem. And I'm going to show you a little bit of evidence from the English case from the 18th century about the emergence of a public space in England and how that was highly correlated with the construction of a very different type of state and society. What causes this fragmentation or this need for a social transformation, according to the governor? He talked a lot about clientelism. And in some sense, what you could see my remarks in the next 8 minutes as being a sort of, as a kind of reflection on the need to embed clientelism in a much broader context. So I think, yes, there is clientelism. But from my kind of academic perspective, clientelism is a facet of a much broader problem in Colombian society, which is to do with the way the state is constructed. So Juan Ricardo was talking exactly about that. Colombia doesn't have a modern state. It looks like it does. If you look at the constitution, or maybe you hang out in a few institutions in Bogota, but actually it doesn't have a modern state. It has a system of informality, which Juan Ricardo was talking about. Most of the state works on informal rules, social norms, may or may not be consistent with the written rules. And, if you start looking at the pieces of the state, what a political scientist or a sociologist would look at, the fiscal system. Colombia doesn't have a modern fiscal system. It has an incredibly debilitated fiscal system. Juan Ricardo talked a little bit about that. It doesn't have a modern Weberian administration. He talked about that too. It certainly doesn't have a monopoly of violence. About that, and it doesn't have a consolidated territory either. There's these enormous vacuums of authority and the presence of the state. Now, what I've been struggling to understand is how all that fits together. And I think, it's difficult to understand how it fits all together. It's easy to look at some of the interests in this system. So it turns out that even though this system, this architecture of state, the interrelations between state and society creates enormously perverse consequences for Colombians, some people are just making out beautifully from the whole thing. So there are a lot of vested interests in the system, that's for sure. But I think the most difficult thing to sort of understand about the equilibrium in Colombia is that it's been going for a long, long time. I'm not sure exactly when, but certainly since the 1860s, when the Liberals set up this extremely disaggregated way of running the country, so that the central state is very weak. It negotiates with the periphery, it leaves the periphery alone in exchange for political support, in exchange for... So what Juan Ricardo was discussing was sort of how that works in many ways today. But I think that goes back a long, long way, this way country, this model of governance, this model of state-society relations that leaves vast areas of the country lawless, stateless, in charge of whoever happens to be on top at that moment. And that's why it's so easy for people running the Colombian state to negotiate with gangsters, for politicians to cozy up to Pablo Escobar, for them to invite Mancuso to Congress to hang out and, give a speech. And this is, there's nothing surprising about this. There's nothing surprising about this because the way the state is organized, that's always been how it was. The people at the center always negotiated with whoever was the Mancuso of that decade or that century. It's just the way things work. Now, there's nothing very surprising about that. Lots of states work like that in the world. Pakistan works like that. The Sudan works like that. The Central African Republic works like that. In the Central African Republic, they have a concept called the PK-12 state. And the PK-12 state is, the state ends at the PK market, which is 12 miles outside Bangui, which is the capital. And then the rest of the country is something different, to be negotiated with, to be bargained with. So Colombia is a little bit better than the PK-12 state. But the model is there. It's much more complex. But I think the most complicated issue in terms of thinking about how to reform this or how to change this or how to create a dynamic, because that's what's needed to move the society in a different direction, is that so much of this, the way the state and the way the society functions and interacts with the state, is sort of perversely institutionalized into people's way of behaving, their ways of their expectations, their beliefs about how society functions. And people. Okay, so let me give you one connection between this. I could spend hours talking about this, but I shouldn't because there's people here who understand much more about it. Let me just tell you one thing about how I think this connects to violence. Okay. So here's something remarkable that I discovered. This was actually pointed out to me by Antonio Navarro, the politician, who some of you probably know, who was himself, of course, an ex-guerrillero. And he pointed out a clause in the 1980 Penal Code. So here it is. It says, crimes against the constitutional regime of rebellion, sedition, and riot. Those who, by use of arms to overthrow the national government or who delete or modify the legal constitutional regime by force incur imprisonment of from 3 to 6 years. Now, maybe that was a mistake. Maybe somebody, meant to be 30 or 60 or something. But I don't think it is a mistake. I think rebellion, armed rebellion, has always been a legitimate activity in Colombia. People, if you get a 3-year prison sentence in Colombia, how much time do you serve? Like 3 months or something? 6 months? Nothing. Okay. So Antonio Navarro said to me, he said, I was a guerrilla. And suddenly I realized what I was doing was a perfectly legitimate activity. Armed rebellion against the state was a legitimate activity. And that, I think, is buried, it's in the way the state is constructed, the way the state relates to the periphery, the presence of armed actors, armed conflict, armed rebellion. That's all part of how this thing hangs together, and it always has been. The problem is, this is almost sort of subconscious. It's in what a psychologist would call system number one. System number one is that intuitive, emotional, kind of spontaneous part of your psyche which makes most decisions for you. Psychologists separate between system number one and system number two. System number two is the rational, calculating part of the brain that sort of tries to figure out what's going on and is this right or is this wrong. System number one doesn't ask questions. It just behaves. It just acts. And where does that come from? Well, it's an evolutionary mechanism. It's a way we make decisions, but it's affected by the structure of society. It's affected by how society is organized. And in a situation like Colombia, where this is so historical, the way the state has worked, I think everybody, a lot of our present company accepted, they just internalize this way of doing things. I could give you lots of examples, but the favorite example, which I learned from Maria Teresa Ronderos, is this thing which was said about Virgilio Barco. Virgilio Barco, MIT-trained engineer. When he was in Bogota, he was a technocrat. When he was in Cucuta, he was a manzanillo. When you're in you know, you behave in a different way. There's a different set of rules. There's a different set of impulses. There's a different way that system number one functions. So it's sort of internalized. So there is it's a sort of perverse institutionalization of the way society works. And the real problem in terms of changing things is that people just don't even realize that this is not a normal way for the country to function. So yes, there are political challenges, you know, and we can all think of the political challenges. Governor Fajardo he has a strategy. He has an analysis of the political problems, and he has a strategy for combating those political problems. But how you scale that up, or how you deal with some of the political challenges Juan Ricardo was talking about, that remains to be seen. Is that something that can be done by the type of leadership he's been trying to show in Medellin, in Antioquia? You know, James Madison, who wrote the Federalist Papers, you know, he was all in favor of leadership. But, you know, what he observed is that it's very difficult to come by. And if I ask myself, you know, where was it that a modern state, you know, non-clientelistic society came from in England, I think it was not really from leadership, though it's good to have it. It was from the gradual, slow coalescence, emergence of a different type of civil society, if anything else. So this, by the way, is not so unusual. If you went back to 15th century England, it was more or less the same thing. You know, treason against the state was not a crime in 15th century England. You know, and most people who engaged in it just walked away without going to prison or anything else. A couple of the ringleaders might have been beheaded, but for most people, rebellion was a legitimate activity, and it still is in Colombia. So, let me show you some. Let me say a little bit about fragmentation. So one of the things. What I'm suggesting is that, you know, one of the things that keeps this perverse situation in place. So think of clientelism, yes, but think of clientelism as mutually constructed with the state and the way the state works and the things that Juan Ricardo was talking about. So this is all lacking a modern state. So the question is, you know, how do you get to this modern state? What strategy do you use? So I'm suggesting that that's a political problem, but it's a very difficult problem because of this what I'm calling the system number one problem. Okay, so here's what Governor Fajardo was talking about, and here's why I think this creates enormous difficulties. So I was very struck in 2013 when all these paros were taking place about how parochial they were. You know, the paros, you know, who was complaining? You know, the coffee growers were complaining. What were they complaining about? The price of coffee. You know, the sugar producers were complaining. What were they complaining about? They were complaining about panela. What did they want the government to do? They wanted the government to buy 3,000 tons of panela. The egg producers were complaining. It's all, you know, they're all complaining. They all have their problems, but they're all so isolated. They're all so disconnected. They just have these parochial interests. Nobody had a coherent analysis of what the real problem was, which is the way the society functions. There was a beautiful article here in El Espectador about this, where it just emphasizes, you know, in some sense, the only thing anyone had in common was the dislike of the free trade agreement. Everything else was contradictory, it was mutually contradictory, there was no sort of public sphere. But, you know, this is exactly what you'd expect, this fragmentation. And, of course, talking about interests in the situation, what was also striking to me was what an easy situation this is to manage for political elites in Bogota. You buy some tons of panela, you give a few subsidies here. You know, this is beautifully easy to manage. So there's no incentive here. There's no impulse for state building or coming up with a project to construct a more effective state, because this is just unthreatening. This is very easy to manage, this type of contestation in society. And here's some data about the transformation in England, which I find very interesting. This is data put together by the sociologist Charles Tilley about the changing nature of contentious gatherings in southeast England, okay, in the late second half of the 18th century. So what's interesting about this? Well, look at the first two rows, attacks on objects and attacks on persons. So Tilley looked at evidence on gatherings, riots, demonstrations. Particularly he was interested in when there was a recession, when there was a harvest failure, when there was a business cycle depression. And he looked at what did people complain about. They start by burning down the house of the baker, or complaining that food prices were too high or wages were too low. But by the end of the century, by the early 19th century, they stop burning down people's houses or attacking people or objects, and they start complaining to the national government or the local government, particularly the national government. And they stop complaining about our wages are too low or the price of bread is too high, and they start complaining about the system. So what you see, if you look at the language of contention over this period, is that civil society changes. People come up with a coherent interpretation of what the problem is. The system needs reforming. Old corruption, as it was called, needs eradicating. And that's what creates an impulse towards a modern state in England. So if you ask me, what was the most optimistic thing I could say about Colombia, well, I try to look at the same process. Is civil society growing? Is civil society flourishing? Is it connecting? Governor Fajardo was very interesting about there's no communication between the departments. End. Okay, so 1 second. What does this show you? Well, this is data from CINEP we've been analysing. It shows the share of protests recorded by CINEP from 1975 which address an issue which is broader than the municipality. So instead of just complaining about what's going on in my municipality, Colombians are complaining more about broader issues in society. And that's a good thing. Whoops. What else? They're also complaining about different things. If you look at what people complain about in Colombia, it's changed a lot. People complain a lot more now about national policy, and they complain about their rights being violated. Now, there's a crucial thing. Okay? It's not just about me. It's about a right. It's about some principle. It's about something that should be worked. I'm not sure this is quantitatively large enough to represent a different type of Colombia. My view of what's going on in Colombia, the way things work at the moment, is that there's enormous challenges in changing this equilibrium. It's so embedded in the way the society and people work. What would be hopeful? I was asked to say something optimistic. This is optimistic. This is the change in civil society. You're not going to get this from some benevolent national politician, of course, unless you become president. And how do I know you're not going to get it from some benevolent national politician? Well, let's go back to the Pacific. We were talking about the Pacific. The gentleman didn't mention this President Santos's initiative called Todos Somos Pacífico. So last October he launched an initiative. With territorial peace, we're rebuilding the territories. Let's allocate resources. We'll put energy into rebuilding. What did President Santos do? He went to Buenaventura. He created a junta. Who was on the junta? A bunch of machine politicians from Valle and his former campaign manager from Nariño. Here's his speech. Okay? What's he doing here? He's dishing out ladder. So you should read the whole speech. I mean, it's as unstatesmanlike as a presidential speech as you can possibly imagine. Okay? And in fact, when I read it, it reminded me of something President Kennedy said in his inaugural speech, which was, you can see it there. Ask not what that your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. But President Santos is still in clientelistic mode. It's interesting because he has no re-election incentives, but his vice president does. He's just going to El Choco to hand out money and regalitos and read the speech. So this is not the psychology of transformation in Colombia. Nothing could be different from what we heard this morning from Governor Fajardo. But I don't think it's not his fault. I don't know President Santos. So I'd like to just end with this as an example of this is system number one in action. I think President Santos doesn't get it. He's just so socialized into this way of thinking about how Colombia works. He can't see there's an alternative, So, okay, that's it.